Hey, you, welcome to the podcast. Today we're going to talk a little bit about suffering because when you're trying to lose weight, there's a lot of that going on. I mean, it feels like such a first world problem, and let's face it, we're going to acknowledge it right now. It really is, okay? We get that. But it's still a part of the journey that God has us on in our lives right now. So I want to talk to you about suffering and how there's beauty in our suffering. I know if you're in the Seeker's Method, you know that we just talked a lot about, how we don't want to waste this wilderness season that we're in right now. We're just like the Israelites embarking on our own wilderness journey, and there will be suffering, and to embrace it and to get excited because on the other side of suffering is your promised land. But I want to talk to you about how to see your suffering, how to live with it, how to walk through it, and then how to transfer it into being the method by which you will start living for God, even on your weight loss journey. So I'm going to start by sharing some scripture with you this morning. I'm just going to read it because I think it's powerful. And in fact, as I read it this morning, I'm like, that doesn't even sound like it came from the Bible. Like, it just sounds like amazing guidance that applies to us even in weight loss. So I'm going to just read 1 Peter 4:1-3, which says, "So then, since Christ suffered physical pain, you must arm yourselves with the same attitude that he had, and to be ready to suffer too. For if you have suffered physically for Christ, you have finished with sin. You won't spend the rest of your lives chasing your own desires, but you will be anxious to do the will of God. You have had enough of the past. No, really, could I read? You have had enough in the past of the evil things that godless people enjoy, their immorality and their lust, their feasting and their drunkenness and their wild parties, and their terrible worship of idols." Girl, each one of those scriptures, we could unpack every single one from lust to feasting to drunkenness, wild party, worshiping of idols, even in weight loss. I mean, we could do, but I'm just really going to dive in and talk to you a little bit about what stood out to me as I was reading this, because this scripture tells us that we should be ready to suffer. Our weight loss, as you know, especially if you're in the Seeker's Method, especially if you're following along and doing the daily devotional work, you're seeing that suffering is a part of it. The scripture says that if you've suffered physically for Christ, you have finished with sin. I mean, you know that I teach in the Seeker's Method how I show you how to see your food and your disobedience as sin, because sin, according to James 4:17, is when you know what you should do and you don't do it. That is sin to you. So how true is all of this scripture that I just shared with you? How true is it in your life? If you perpetually suffer in your flesh around temptation, around that one thing that you desire to eat, have you noticed that you've begun to no longer be tempted by it? And if you're not quite there yet, I want you to get excited, because that is in your future if you simply keep fighting your flesh. Verse 2 of the scripture set that I just read to you says that you won't spend the rest of your life chasing your own desires, but you will be anxious to do the will of God. That is in your near horizon, but it's going to require that you keep facing him despite how real and how strong and how big that temptation is. And you know that I add to this scripture, where it says that you won't spend the rest of your life chasing your own desires, but you will be anxious to do the will of God. And I like to say, even in weight loss. So soon you will begin to be led in the Spirit. And when you are being led in the Spirit, when you're leading in the Spirit, even in your food choices, you will make the connection between your food and your faith. You will no longer seek to lose weight as much as you will desire to gain God. Soon enough, your denial of temptation and the foods that just don't work for you in this season of your life, soon enough, it will all be about the work that God is doing in your life, that he's doing in your heart. And you will begin to see that he is transferring your faith from just knowledge that you have about faith, about him, to a knowing in your heart. And once that transfer has actually taken place, once you have this true heart faith, even in the kitchen that I talk about all the time, you will start to become stronger because you will be able to see the truth in what verse 3 says, and how it says that you have had enough in the past of the evil things that godless people enjoy. Their immorality and their lust and their feasting and their drunkenness and their wild parties and their terrible worship of idols. You will be able to see the role that food and even alcohol used to have in your life relative to the role it has now. It's like God is giving you eyes to see and ears to hear, even in weight loss. So very soon you will start living for God, even in your food choices. Because once you step into the clarity and the discernment of God's voice in your life, even in the food choices, there will be nothing that tastes so good that you would be willing to sacrifice hearing His voice. This is why I always say, your food choice, your God voice. So be encouraged about this. I know it's hard right now, but be encouraged and see your sufferings, your suffering right now in the flesh, as suffering for Christ. And be finished with sin and allow yourself to see your suffering as how you practice releasing the strongholds of this world.